This lesson covers Domain 1, Agile Principles and Mindset. Domain 1 discusses explore, embrace, and applying Agile principles and mindsets within the context of the project team and organization. There will be 16% of the items in the PMI ACP test come from this domain, about 19 out of the 120 questions. There are 9 tasks within Domain 1. The first task is to advocate for Agile principles by modeling those principles and discussing Agile values in order to develop a shared mindset across the team as well as between the customer and the team. The second is to help ensure that everyone has a common understanding of the values and principles of Agile and a common knowledge around the Agile practices and terminology being used in order to work effectively. These 2 tasks highlight the importance of championing these Agile principles as a leader, modeling the behaviors, and discussing these values between the team and the organization and your customers to help everybody understand what Agile is really trying to do and help everyone get pointed in the right direction. The third task is to support change at the system or organizational level by educating the organization and influencing processes, behaviors, and people in order to make the organization more effective and efficient. There are 2 main points that come out of this task. The first is that you don't have responsibility just for your project as an Agile leader, but you really should be striving to improve the organization. And the second is that as an Agile leader, you influences process, behaviors, and people to become more efficient. It's not just about a process or people, but really everybody, all of those aspects working together, people and processes. The fourth task is practice visualization by maintaining highly visible information radiators showing real progress and real team performance in order to enhance transparency and trust. We'll talk more about this later, but the key words in this task are information radiators. In Agile, you spend a lot of time talking about transparency and with the team, so you shouldn't be hiding the state of the project. You use information radiators to highlight the important metrics or goings-on of the project. There's an expression I heard before that really highlights this, and it goes, if you don't make it big and visible, your project will be terrible and miserable. That saying really emphasizes the need for information radiators. The next task is to contribute to a safe and trustful team environment by allowing everyone to experiment and make mistakes so that each can learn and continuously improve the way he or she works. The 6th task somewhat goes along with the 5th, and that is to enhance creativity by experimenting with new techniques and process ideas in order to discover more efficient and effective ways of working. These 2 tasks highlight for both individuals and teams to create an environment where people can try new things so they can get better as a person or improve their technical abilities, both from the team perspective, and learn to operate better with new processes that will improve. One thing that you do in Agile is you're constantly trying to learn and improve, not just maintain the status quo. The 7th task is encourage team members to share knowledge by collaborating and working together in order to lower risks around knowledge silos and reduce bottlenecks. Traditionally, in waterfall mindset organizations, there might be a development team, a business analysis team, a testing team, and they all operate individually and in their silos. Within Agile, you want everyone coming together. You don't have a dev team versus a QA team, but it's really more of an integrated group. This improves your efficiency in a variety of ways. The eighth task is to encourage emergent leadership within the team by establishing a safe and respectful environment in which new approaches can be tried in order to make improvements and foster self-organization and empowerment. Other tasks, we've talked about the environment so you can try new things, but self-organization is what I really want you to take from this task. Self-organization is where the team decides the way to structure their work in order to execute it best, versus a project manager or someone more senior to the team deciding how it's done. It's very important in Agile to push responsibility and authority down as low as possible, because the team members who are doing the work are usually in the best positions to know how to execute that work best. And the final task is to practice servant leadership by supporting and encouraging others in their endeavors so that they can perform at their highest level and continue to improve. Servant leadership we'll talk about later, but in a nutshell, in Agile, your role as a leader in the context of servant leadership is to support the team in which whatever is most needed. If it's a new team, you may be spending more time teaching and coaching. And if you're a high-performing team, you will have a much more hands-off approach and allow them to execute as they need to. Some of the topics that we'll talk about during the Domain 1 training are Agile values and principles, Agile framework and terminology, Agile methodologies, and Agile leadership and behaviors. We'll go into much more detail on these topics, but this is the main areas that will be covered in Domain 1. Now, the key takeaway from this training is that you should have a good understanding of the tasks. You'll hear this time and again, but you don't have to have the tasks memorized word for word, but you should understand spiritually what they are saying. Pushing responsibility down, creating a good environment for experimentation. This is the first grounding in the Agile mindset that will occur. This lesson covers the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto was created in February 2001 from a group of distinguished software development leaders in Snowbird, Utah. They held a meeting where they discussed the future of software. This manifesto was published to define core principles and approaches to developing software more effectively. These people discussed what are the great practices that they've learned over their careers, what things didn't work, and they really tried to get to a high set of values that would govern and teach people how to create software more effectively. The Agile Manifesto really defines what to do in Agile projects versus the details of how to execute the projects. There are many different implementations to Agile, such as Scrum, Lean, or Kanban. We'll discuss these more in future lessons, but the key point here is, while all of the implementations have different specific practices, they all conform to the high-level guidance of the Agile Manifesto. The Agile Manifesto states, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. You can find the Agile Manifesto at www.agilemanifesto.org. Now let's talk about what the four main parts of the Agile Manifesto mean. In the first one, individuals and interactions over processes and tools. What Agile implies is that the people are the most important, and how they get along are much more, and work together, have much more value than any processes or tools that may be used in the project. In traditional waterfall you have rules and ways of doing things that are really guide rails, and to make sure you don't go too far one way or the other. And in the Agile Manifesto, there are less rules in place, and we expect the individuals to use good judgment to make decisions on how things work. The second value is working software over comprehensive documentation. This states that customers will really want and value software much more than the documents they maybe put together, like a requirement specification or a design description. The main currency in Agile is the working software, and that should always be what you spend more time on. And really, with documentation, you should do as minimal as possible. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. This third value gets to that very often you can spend lots and lots of time working on T's and C's and 6 months spending negotiating a contract, where it would be much more valuable to just start the work and start learning what people wanted. Instead of trying to prove that you're right as a software development team and point back to a specification to point like, see, that's what the requirement said. Agile tries to say that you really should be working with your customer more to understand and optimize what value they deliver versus just meeting the specifications of a requirement. And finally, responding to change over following a plan. In waterfall, you hear things like gold plating, change control boards, and you have very rigorous processes to try to minimize as much change during the project as possible. What Agile does is pretty much turn it on its head and says, change is fine, and there's lots of value in change if you're learning things. And instead of creating processes to prevent change, we're going to create approaches that allow us to react to change and learning much more effectively. Gold plating doesn't necessarily have a negative term in Agile. It's really more what's the most value for your customer. And to the final point of where there's value on items on the right, we value the items on the left more. What's really important is what this means is people don't say that there's no value for those items in red. It's just that when you're making trade-offs, you want to value the ones on the left more. So the key takeaway from this lesson is that you should know the Agile Manifesto exactly word for word. There may be questions on the test where knowing what is more important, what's on the left side versus the right side, may give you the key to a correct answer versus an incorrect one. This lesson covers the 12 Agile Principles. The 12 Agile Principles are some further guidance that the creators of the Agile Manifesto developed to help people understand what they were getting at during the creation of that so important document. The first Agile principle is customer satisfaction. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. By delivering early, you can get better feedback from your customers. You're letting those customers know you're making progress by giving them working software, and you're delivering actual value to those customers potentially by delivering the top priority requirements. The second principle is welcome changing requirements, even late in development. Agile harnesses change for the customer's competitive advantage. You simplify the change control process. You try to minimize what documentation is required and or what approval is needed. By creating a system where you can respond quickly to customers' needs, be them learnings from your product, competitive responses, or even external changes in the external environment, you can actually make change into a competitive advantage for your customer. The third principle is frequent frequent delivery. Deliver working software frequently, from a couple of weeks to a couple of months, with a preference to the shorter timescale. By doing this, you can release the product to the market faster, either directly through a customer, to a customer, or the customer can deliver it. Very similar to the first one, if you're delivering frequently, you can provide value to those customers with working features. And by making the project shorter, it can be more structured, and you're creating a fixed delivery time frame, so you can focus on the delivery of value versus trying to understand, constantly replanning your project. Motivated individuals. Build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and the support they need, and trust them to get the job done. Within Agile, you really want team members to become self-organizing, and so they structure the work in the way they think it's best to be executed, and not through external management influence. The team becomes empowered to make daily decisions, and so you spend less time running something up the flagpole or the chain, or whatever terminology you use. And by pushing the responsibility and authority down, team members become more motivated to achieve success. You really do not want to. Agile really goes against any type of micromanagement. Face-to-face conversations. The most efficient and effective way of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face communication. This allows you to get direct feedback by going to the source of the problem or confusion. It's very often through oral communication at the workplace. There's a secondary benefit that if you hear people talking about a problem, you might absorb or osmotically communicate. And then teams today are not all just in one office location, but there's tools like Skype or Google Hangouts that can still facilitate these face-to-face conversations, even if they're over the internet. The seventh Agile principle is working software. Working software is the primary measure of progress. As we mentioned before, working software, when you deliver it, enhances customer satisfaction. You start to measure on the completion of working software as opposed to the completion of a document, which does not always reflect how much work or how much progress you have made. The software will then ultimately be judged on whether it can support your overall project goals, as opposed to just % complete. Constant pace. Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. What Agile strives for is, instead of in traditional projects where at the end of the project everybody's hair is on fire and you're working long hours to get all of the work done, by making shorter time boxes and by having the team commit to what they can accomplish during that time box by using velocity or past performance, you should be able to continuously develop and you don't have spikes of work. By keeping a proper work-life balance, you'll have a happy team, which will then be a motivated and productive team. And by having a motivated and productive team, they can respond quickly to changes. Continuous attention. Continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Agility is the ability to modify, improve, or upgrade in a short period of time. By paying attention to your design and your code, you spend less time fixing underlying bugs or issues, and you can spend more time on achieving quality code and finishing the requirements. You instead of just focusing on feature delivery and then waiting for some other time to fix everything, to fix issues that you might develop, your goal is to constantly, at the end of a sprint or iteration, have a product that meets quality standards. Simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. By focusing on what is essential to create value to the project and the customer, you can discard and avoid anything that does not add those values, be it features, processes, or documentation. Additionally, the simpler that you make the product, the easier it will be to maintain, and there are less risks that will come up on your project. Self-organization. The best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. You'll hear self-organization a lot, and what this really gets at is that the team is the most knowledgeable on how to carry out the work. Not the project manager, not the HR department, not senior management. They are the ones that will become experts on the processes and the product and what is the best way to execute the work that is required for the project. And by pushing this down, your team will become more motivated for success. And finally, regular reflection. At regular intervals, the team reflects on how to become more effective, then tunes and adjusts its behavior accordingly. This differs from traditional waterfall, that while in traditional waterfall you might do a lessons learned at the end of a project or a phase, these are very long-lasting items, and you generally forget what's done, and you're already on to the next project very often by the time you have these lessons learned. What Agile tries is to implement regular retrospectives as the primary tool at the end of each sprint to look at what works and what doesn't and what can be improved, and what changes can be made immediately. With the combination of individuals and interactions over processes and tools and the authority being pushed down, very often the team can make the changes that are most critical to their success versus having to ask for deviations from senior management. So the key takeaway from this section is that you should understand the 12 Agile principles. This is not something that you have to know word for word, but spiritually understanding what those principles mean and what they're looking for will be important, as it'll be a thread throughout all of the questions on the project. This lesson is an overview on Agile. We start with, what is Agile? Well, one definition of Agile is the ability to move quickly and easily. So what is Agile software development? Agile software development describes a set of principles for software development under which requirements and solutions evolve through collaborative effort of self-organizing, cross-functional teams. It advocates adaptive planning, evolutionary development, early delivery, and continuous improvement, and it encourages rapid and flexible responding to change. These principles support the definition and the continued evolution of many software development methodologies. So what is distinct about Agile? Well, the first is that it is iterative and incremental. Most Agile development methods break up product development into small increments that minimize the amount of upfront planning and designs. These iterations are short timeframes that typically last from 1 to 4 weeks. Each iteration involves a cross-functional team working to all functions: planning, analysis, design, coding, unit testing, and acceptance testing. At the end of an iteration, a working product is demonstrated to stakeholders. This minimizes overall risk and allows the product to adapt to changes quickly. An iteration might not have enough functionality to warrant a market release, but the goal is to have an available release at the end of each iteration. Efficient and face-to-face communication is a second distinctive area about Agile. No matter what development methodology is followed, each team should include a customer representative. This person is agreed by stakeholders to act on their behalf and makes a personal commitment to being available for developers and the whole team to answer questions throughout the iteration. At the end of each iteration, stakeholders and the customer representative review progress and reevaluate priorities with a view on optimizing the return for the project and ensuring alignment with customer needs and company goals. The third distinct area is short feedback loops. A common characteristic in Agile software development is the daily stand-up or daily scrum. In a brief session, the team members report to each other what they did the previous day towards their team's iteration goals, what they intend to do today, and any roadblocks or impediments that they can see to the goals. Additionally, at the end of iterations, you also seek feedback on the working product from the stakeholders. And the fourth distinct area is quality focus. There are specific tools and techniques such as automated unit testing, paired programming, continuous integration, test-driven development, and code refactoring. And other techniques are often used to improve quality, enhance product development agility. What are some of the differences between Agile and traditional? And when I say traditional, I mean waterfall methodologies. So the first difference is predictive planning versus adaptive planning. In waterfall, you make your plan at the beginning of the project when you have the least information and try to predict precisely when you will finish developing the scope that you've been asked to and what the cost and duration will be. While Agile promotes adaptive planning, which recognizes that you have the least amount of information in the beginning, and you just try and make a coarse-grained plan, and you continuously adapt your plan to what you've learned. In waterfall, you go through each phase once. For example, requirements, design, implement, and test. In Agile, you go through each phase numerous times, once per iteration or sprint. In waterfall methodologies, your primary measure of progress are deliverables, which are often documents, while in Agile, working software is the primary measure of progress. In traditional waterfall, you do a big design up front, where you'll map out and design all of the features for a release in the beginning before you start developing software. In Agile, design is more informal and incremental, and each iteration will build upon the design from the previous time. In Waterfall, interaction with users happens primarily during requirements development and at the end of the project with user testing, while in Agile, you have a high degree of interaction with users throughout the entire project. In Waterfall, there's a focus on meeting the project requirements or specifications. And in Agile, while meeting project requirements are clearly important, there is more value placed on meeting customer needs, whether they're documented in the specifications at the time or not. And the final difference between Agile and traditional is how the team's composed. In Waterfall and traditionally, you'll have structured teams that are functional. You might have a development team, a testing team, a business analysis team, and they operate in functional manners and are siloed apart. While in Agile, you tend to have more cross-functional, self-organizing teams. There are many different Agile methodologies, and this chart now shows a handful of them. Some of them are more practice-centric, like extreme programming or Agile modeling, where they really emphasize technical best practices, be them in development or design or requirements. Other methodologies emphasize workflow, such as Scrum and Kanban. Feature-driven development is an example of a methodology that is more specification-centric. And while there are others that really are more balanced across the full life cycle, like DSDM or RUP, we'll talk more about these life methodologies in a different session. At this point, I want to introduce you to some of the common terms in Agile. These are terms that we'll talk about now and generally apply through most methodologies, although they might be called something slightly different per methodology. An iteration is the uninterrupted period of time during which an Agile development team performs work, most commonly 1 week to 1 month in length, at the end of which the team delivers a potentially shippable product. This is also referred to as a sprint. A backlog is an ever-evolving list of product requirements, which are prioritized by the customer or customer representative that convey to an Agile team which features to implement first. A backlog exists both at a release level and at an iteration level. User stories are a very high-level definition of a requirement, containing just enough information so that the developers can produce a reasonable estimate of the effort to implement that user story. A user story is one or more sentences in the everyday or business language of the end user that captures what the user wants to achieve. A daily meeting is a whole team meeting that happens at the same time every day that usually lasts 15 minutes or less. This meeting is designed to allow the entire team to synchronize with each other and to understand the flow and challenges of the development process. During the meeting, everyone discusses what they have completed yesterday, what they are going to complete today, and what impediments they have. Retrospectives are a time-boxed meeting held at the end of an iteration or at the end of a release, in which the team examines its processes to determine what succeeded and what could be improved. The retrospective is a key to an Agile team's ability to inspect and adapt in the pursuit of continuous improvement. Time boxing is a time management technique that helps organize the performance of work and manage scope. A time box is a fixed length period of time during which an activity is performed. This technique is used in various ways throughout the project, from iteration management, where you have fixed length time to go through the development cycle, to time boxing specific meetings like retrospectives and daily stand-ups. Velocity is a measure of progress, but it's a relative number which describes how much work a team can get done over a period of time. The number is not necessarily used to track progress, but more focused on projecting how much work a team can complete over a number of iterations. So up to this point, we've talked about Agile primarily in the view of software development. And throughout the lessons, this will be generally the case. But Agile can be used outside of software development. And during the test, you may be asked about this differently. And so what are some ways that you can use Agile methodologies and techniques outside software development? One way is with integrated customer engagement. You can embed your customers within any delivery process to share accountability for product or service delivery. For example, the marketing team can have a support desk personnel sit with them so they understand more of how the customers think, perhaps when they're calling in about bugs or questions about how the product may be used. You can use facilitation-based management, such as having daily stand-ups or Scrum Masters, that can help manage the day-to-day tasks and operations of any team, regardless of what domain, discipline, or functionality they operate in. Agile work practices, such as adopting specific iterative and incremental work practices using Scrum or Kanban, can be used across all business functions, from sales to human resources, finance, or marketing. And an enabling organizational structure with a focus on staff engagement, personal autonomy, and outcomes-based governance can be used as well. The key takeaways and tips from this section are that Agile is a set of principles, not necessarily a specific development framework. In fact, there are many development frameworks that fall under the Agile umbrella. The second takeaway is that while we talk about Agile primarily in view of software development, and that is still where it's used most, it can be used in other areas. And Agile is focused on iterative, incremental, and evolutionary development, efficient face-to-face communication, very short feedback loop and adaptation cycles, and quality focus. This next lesson is an overview of Scrum. Scrum is by far the most popular framework today for developing and sustaining complex products in an agile environment. Scrum is lightweight, simple to understand, but difficult to master. There are three pillars to Scrum: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. Transparency promotes the concept that the people who are accountable for the work being done should know the state of the project. There are items like burn down logs or risk boards, which we'll talk about in more detail in later sections, that give the team in Scrum the transparency they need to be successful. Inspection. During Scrum, the team should be able to inspect the products that are being done and make adjustments to the products or processes necessary in order to be successful. And adaptation. When the team inspects the products or processes that are going on, they should be able to make adjustments as necessary when they are having deviations or potential negative outcomes. And then on top of the pillars, there are 5 values. The 5 values are pretty self-explanatory and not of utmost importance to the test. However, commitment, courage, focus, openness, and respect. Having these 5 values in mind are what also makes the Agile Mindset. This slide from scrum.org shows the generic Scrum framework. We'll go into more detail about all of the events later, but we'll quickly go through this now. You start with a product backlog, a prioritized list of everything that people want to get accomplished for that product. You break it down and you do sprint planning to understand what will be going on in the sprint. That builds a sprint backlog. The Scrum team, over a short period of time, will work on that sprint backlog, watching it every day with a daily Scrum. At the end of the sprint, they will demonstrate what they have completed in the sprint review, which leads to a sprint retrospective and a potentially shippable increment of product. Now, when we discuss the Scrum team, there are 3 key behaviors that they successful Scrum teams exhibit. 1, they are self-organizing. The team will determine the best way to accomplish the work. 2, they are cross-functional. All of the skills necessary to be successful are on the Scrum team. And 3, they deliver the product iteratively and incrementally. That means they don't try and develop it all at once, and they deliver pieces at a time. There are 3 roles within the Scrum team: the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. The product owner is responsible for maximizing the value of the product and the work of the development team. That means they are focused on value, as we mentioned here. It doesn't mean that they dictate how the development team operates or oversees the development team. It's the value of the product that is important. They are accountable for the backlog management. As you saw before, there's a product backlog. So they are responsible for making sure each of the items in that backlog are understood. They prioritize the items or order them in the backlog in order to best accomplish the product goals or missions. That means ideally, if you have 10 items in the backlog, they are numbered 1 through 10. And the product owner is responsible for that. They're responsible for optimizing the value of the work the development team performs. Again, this goes to making sure they're working on the most important things in the product backlog. And along with the pillars of Scrum, ensuring that the product backlog is visible, transparent, and clear to all, and shows what the Scrum team will work on next. This is of utmost importance so the team understands the micro decisions they will make and how, like, designing something in a certain way or coding it in a certain way, and knowing what is they're working on and what's coming next will help them best make those little decisions. And finally, they're responsible for ensuring the team understands items in the backlog to the level needed. At different points in the life cycle of the project, more detail is needed. We'll talk about that more in another domain, but in the beginning, when you're first looking at something, you need maybe a few sentences. And when you're getting ready to test it, you need to have much more detail about what that backlog item means. And one of the things that's important is there is one individual that is responsible. That is the product owner. It is not a committee of people. Clearly, product owners will get insight and work collaboratively with others, but there is a singular responsibility for that. The development team. This is the second of the 3 team roles. And clearly they are the largest of the teams. And these are the professionals who actually do the development and delivery of a potentially releasable increment of done product at the end of the sprint. You may have heard me emphasize the word done, and we'll talk about that later. But basically, these are the developers, the testers, the business analysts, the people who are necessary to build the working product. As mentioned before, they are self-organizing and have all of the skills necessary to create the product increment. The next 2 bullets, having no titles and no sub-teams, are very critical for the organization of the Scrum team. Scrum promotes that there is no hierarchy and there is just the team. And so you don't have seniors and juniors, or this is the QA team and the BA sub-team or the feature sub-team within a Scrum team. They are one team, and accountability belongs to that team as a whole. The ideal team size for a Scrum team, when you don't include the Scrum Master and the product owner, is really between 3 and 9 people. There's the common vernacular where people say that, you have the right size of a Scrum team if they can share 2 pizzas for lunch. Well, 2 pizzas for 3 people might be a little large, but you get what we're saying here. This is a small team, and when you're answering questions within Scrum for the test, this is the size team you should be considering. And the third team role of Scrum is the Scrum Master. They are responsible for ensuring that the team understands and enacts Scrum. That means they understand the processes and that they are following the agreed upon Scrum processes correctly. They are a servant leader. We talk about servant leader as part of the Agile mindset, but again, this is where they are doing what is necessary to ultimately help the team be as successful as possible, be it removing roadblocks or coaching or mentoring. The servant leader performs situational leadership to optimize the success of the Scrum team. The Scrum Master also helps those who are outside the Scrum team understand which interactions are helpful and which aren't. What that means is there'll be lots of people who want to talk to people on the team or give them feedback or things like that. And it's helping. The Scrum team doesn't go off and work in isolation, but the Scrum Master helps those external stakeholders understand the right way to engage. They provide service to the rest of the team in a variety of ways. To the product owner, they help manage the backlog and maximizing value. As we mentioned before, the product owner is accountable for this, but the product owners very often don't have the understanding of product planning. So the Scrum Master will help product owners understand and prioritize the backlog to maximize the value. Product owners, without the product planning and Scrum Master expertise, can just prioritize in a very hodgepodge way, but helping them understand release planning and how much in general they will be able to get from a team is important to making a holistic product plan. The development team. The main thing that you hear from Scrum teams is to remove impediments for the Scrum team. That's a Scrum Master's responsibility. They also have a responsibility of coaching the development team and, as needed, facilitating the Scrum events. The Scrum Master doesn't always facilitate events, but they are the one who should be most suited to be able to do it as the development team needs. And the third group they provide service to is the whole organization. The Scrum Master is critical in supporting Scrum adopting throughout the organization and the sharing of Scrum practices and what works and what doesn't work in the organization's environment. So what are the key takeaways from this section? The first is that while Scrum is the most popular framework, it is important to know it's not the only one. We will be during the training, you'll learn about other Agile frameworks. And while Scrum is the most popular, and many people have a very strong grounding in Scrum, which is great, they need to understand it's not the only way of operating in an Agile environment. It's important to know that there are 3 roles in Scrum: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the team, and there are only 3 roles. The product owner is responsible for the backlog, the product backlog. That is the most important responsibility that product owner has. And then finally, the Scrum Master is responsible for the team operating. That means following the Scrum processes and practices and helping and coaching the team to an optimal operating approach. This session discusses the Scrum Events. The Scrum framework is a simple, lightweight framework. You start with a product backlog, and then you move into sprint planning. Sprint planning yields a sprint backlog. Then you execute during the sprint and have a daily Scrum. At the end of the sprint, you have a sprint review where you review what you've built, and that leads to both a potentially shippable increment of your product and a sprint retrospective. In this section, we will go into much more detail about the different events that are accomplished as part of the Scrum framework. Now, you've heard me say Scrum events, but they're also referred to as ceremonies, activities, or meeting. It's important for both the test and for talking with other Agilists that you understand that people call them different names based on when they learned or who they learned from. But they all really mean the same thing. There are 5 main, as we mentioned, the 5 activities are the sprint planning, the daily Scrum, the sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. Except for the sprint, all of the events are designed to enable transparency and inspection, 2 of the 3 pillars of Scrum. And all of the events are all time boxed. This means you establish before you begin a duration for that activity, and that provides constraints for you to meet it. Now, with the sprint, you should really keep a time box of 1 month or less. The reason you want to keep it short is a variety of reasons. The first is if you keep the horizon short, it minimizes external change, which makes common sense. The less time something's going on, the less of a chance that something outside your control will happen. Additionally, you want to inspect and adapt on at least a monthly basis. When you wait too long, you both don't have as many opportunities to look and change, and you'll start to forget what happened. If you do a lessons learned event at the end of a project that takes 6 months, chances are you're not going to remember what happened in the 5th week of the project that may have been very painful. And the third reason is you want to minimize the potential waste to 1 month of cost. And we say 1 month, but that's if you keep the time box at a month. But basically, the shorter the increments, the less risk you have of developing features that people might not want. At the end of the sprint, a quote-unquote done, usable, potentially releasable product increment is created. Now, we'll talk about what done means, but that's a very important concept in Scrum. But what the other purpose of this is you should be developing software that could be released at the end of every sprint. Now, that doesn't mean you will release it. For example, in an environment I worked in, our customers did not like the software being changed very often. In fact, even though they liked the features, sometimes they wish they never, sometimes they just didn't like any changes to their workflow or anything that would go on a daily basis. But that meant we had lots of sprints where we had features that we could have delivered to them, but we didn't feel the value of an individual sprint was enough to make any changes or downtime for the customer for upgrades. And that's an important concept. It's potentially releasable, not always releasable. Another important factor is that you keep consistent durations through the development effort. And that means the project. And what happens is this will get referred to as the heartbeat of Scrum. You want this cadence to be developed. So if it's, you're delivering every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 1 week, you want to keep that sprint length consistent throughout the project. This helps in a variety of ways. First, your metrics will all be normalized, or your velocity. Second, it allows you to know and develop a routine for work being done. And finally, by having these consistent durations, everybody knows when events are going to occur, both internal and external to the team. For example, you may want stakeholders to attend certain meetings, and knowing that this meeting will happen every 2 weeks allows them to put it on their calendars and maximize the chance of people showing up. And finally, there's no gaps between sprints. When one sprint ends, the next one begins. Now, we discussed what the definition of done. I mentioned done earlier. And what that is it's a team agreed upon shared understanding of what it means for something to be complete. And what that might mean is that there are a variety of definitions. Maybe it's the software is, the user story will have gone through a code review, or the software has been tested and reviewed by the product owner. It's a variety of different things. But it's a common understanding for the team. You'll hear a term, is it done or is it done sometimes? And what that really means is, you shouldn't have that term, but sometimes that means you've completed it, but is it ready to go? But as the team matures, their definition of done should expand. You should always be striving to improve your quality and get better. And so you'll start to add things like the user manual might be updated as before to become done, or performance testing has been done, or the automated build script is complete for that module. What it really gets at is your definition of done starts at one point, but should always improve quality as you go on. When you start off, really there should be some standards for your organization that gives you your initial list of what you need. But as we've discussed, that self-organizing Scrum teams become accountable for their processes, you'll want to build on them as necessary. If you're finding that you're having some quality issues because of a certain aspect of your process that maybe no other team is going for, you shouldn't wait for the organization to tell you how to fix it. A perfectly viable approach is that you add to your definition of done criteria. The sprint. And during the sprint, there should be no changes that are made that would endanger the sprint goal. New scope should not be coming in throughout the sprint, and your quality goals should not increase. Scope may be clarified and renegotiated between the product owner and the development team as more is learned. One of the expectations is you will not have everything understood when you start the sprint, but because of that trust between the product owner and the development team, as you learn something, that may have an effect. You may learn that, now that I have a full understanding of this issue, it's much larger than I thought. And that might be an opportunity where you discuss the product owner, look, we're not going to get everything done. And what is the least important thing to move out of the sprint? Now, you can cancel a sprint. It's not something that should happen very often, but generally that's because of a large external factor. But ultimately, it's because the sprint goal is obsolete. There's no reason to just finish something for the sake of finishing it. But the product owner is the only one who can cancel a sprint. You don't cancel a sprint because you're not going to get everything complete, or there's higher priority items elsewhere. It's that the product owner makes that decision. And if you cancel a sprint, and the important thing to understand is you put all the backlog items back on the product backlog, the in-progress backlog items back on the backlog. You generally will wrap up what you have completed and form that into a potentially shippable increment, and everything that's in progress, you put back on the product backlog. You don't try and finish it up. Sprint planning. In another lesson, we discuss much more about Agile planning, but for Scrum, what sprint planning does is it plans the work to be performed the next sprint. You're only really looking at one sprint further. It's also time boxed, and the rule of thumb here is a maximum of 8 hours for a 1-month sprint. And you can translate that also to 4 hours for a 2-week sprint and 2 hours for a 1-week sprint. During the sprint planning, you look at two main questions. The first question is, what can be delivered in the increment that resulting from the upcoming sprint? What you look at is the product owner will discuss the sprint goal and which items would achieve that goal. The team then works to forecast the functionality that could be delivered. They use the prioritized backlog, the development team capacity, and past performance. Every time things might be different, but there is an aspect where the development team, how they've delivered in the past, should have some impact to what they can do this sprint. And really, only the development team can assess what can be accomplished in the sprint. That shouldn't be influenced by what the product owner wants, or senior management wants, or taking challenges. The spirit of Scrum says the team assesses what they can do, and they commit to that. And once their forecast, they develop their sprint goal. The second question that gets asked is, how will the work needed to deliver the increment be achieved? So now the team, after they understand the sprint goal, they start designing the system and the work that's needed to create that product increment. There might be some design discussions, some other work that needs to be done to break the products down and have further understanding, or maybe some user stories are clarified or expanded. They'll also decompose the work for the first few days of the sprint. And so what that means is they'll take their user stories and probably break that down into explicit tasks that need to be done. Again, this is self-organizing. the Scrum team, it's not the product owner who decides how it's done, or development management, or the project manager or Scrum Master who decides how the work's being broken down. It's the Scrum team that does that. And the outcome of Scrum planning is a sprint backlog. And so that's the product backlog items which the Scrum team is committed to develop in the sprint, plus a plan to do them. Now, every day the team will have a 15-minute time box meeting to coordinate and create their plan for the next day. It's technically referred to as the daily scrum, but it's also called the daily stand-up. And you can see from the picture, everyone is standing or leaning. And the concept of why they call it that is the meeting should be short enough that everyone can stand throughout it. And there are three main questions that are asked during the daily scrum. The first is, what did I accomplish yesterday that will contribute to the sprint goal? Again, the question is, when you start, what you'll say is you don't want to talk about things that had nothing to do with your work, like I got a new machine yesterday or I went to training. It's I completed module XYZ and it is ready for test. The second question, what am I going to accomplish today? And that will be, if you're the tester, you might say, I'm going to test module XYZ today. And the third question is, what is blocking me from accomplishing my goals? This is where you're looking to others for help. It could be some technical issues with lack of understanding, or I'm waiting on someone else to complete a bug that's blocking my testing, or I'm waiting for a user experience diagram. Ultimately, these three questions are important to make to get a commitment, giving your commitment to the team for your accomplishments, and also asking for the appropriate help. Now, the Scrum Master ensures that the team has the meeting and the meeting works correctly, but it's the team's responsibility for conducting the daily Scrum. What that means is it's not the Scrum Master asking the questions or everybody reporting their answers to the Scrum Master. This is a team accountability, and so it's not the Scrum Master's meeting. It's the team's meeting to be accountable to each other. In general, only the team attends. This is not where senior management gets their updates, and you really want to minimize the presence of outside individuals from the team. It causes a weird behavior to go on where they feel like they're being watched. It does happen where other people will come, and I know sometimes when I was a coach or in management, I would attend to see how things were working. But it's the Scrum Master's responsibility that if there's external individuals there, they should understand what their role is there and not interfere. Sprint review. This is also known as the product demo, and this is the opportunity where you inspect the increment and adapt the backlog. And what that means is you're demoing the product with stakeholders and adapting or updating the product backlog and getting feedback as necessary. It occurs at the end of the sprint, and you demonstrate what is done. You should not be demonstrating half features or anything like that. It should be what has met your definition of done. And the team receives the feedback from the team and other key stakeholders. Very often marketing or support will attend because they may have the best understanding of what the real problem the customer is trying, that we're trying to solve the customer's problem with that feature. As you demonstrate the product, you also discuss any needed changes to the product backlog. Sometimes there's adding things, and very often they're subtracting things. I've seen instances where when the teams develop their feature, someone will say, now that that's done, I don't think there's as much value or even a need for a feature that they had previously asked for. For a 1-month sprint, you want to time box this meeting to 4 hours. And if any of you have ever attended a demonstration, you understand how hard it is to get all the feedback and stay on track, because everybody will have opinions about the features. And so between the product owner and the Scrum Master, it's very critical to both time box and manage this meeting in order to optimize the feedback that you get. And now we're going to talk about the sprint retrospective. At the end of each sprint, you hold the sprint retrospective, and this is really the last event of the sprint. You do it after the sprint review, but before your sprint planning, in order to also take into scope of what you're looking at the sprint review and be able to have the opportunity to influence the sprint planning. Very often you'll have the sprint retrospective and the sprint planning session back to back, where one meeting ends and the next one begins. For a 1 month event, a 1 month sprint, you will hold a maximum of 3-hour time box meeting. And the purpose is to inspect how the sprint went with regards to people, relationship, processes, and tools. Identify and order the major items that went well and create a plan for these improvements. Very often, you can simplify it and say what worked well, what didn't, and what can we improve. But one of the important things here is creating the plan for implementing these improvements. And this is one of the large benefits and differences from your traditional lessons learned. In lessons learned, you can talk about all the things that went well and what didn't, but you don't always talk about creating a plan to fix them. And within Scrum, that's what's critical. And at the end of the retrospective, the team should have identified improvements that they can make themselves in the next sprint. It's not always someone else's responsibility to fix things. And we talk about the self-organizing teams and taking accountability. This goes into effect here as well. We rephrased a question in our retrospectives to further emphasize this by specifically asking, what could the Scrum team do in the next sprint to improve? And that's the essence of the retrospective. And so to recap, the Scrum framework, you start with a product backlog, you move into sprint planning, where you come out with your sprint backlog, which is a plan and a list of items the team will work on in the sprint. You start executing the sprint, and you have daily scrums to look at what did I accomplish yesterday, what am I going to accomplish today, and what is blocking me from being successful. At the end of the sprint, you have a sprint review with stakeholders to demonstrate and get feedback on your potentially shippable increment of software. And you have a sprint retrospective to look at what worked well during the sprint, what didn't work well, and what could be improved. So what are the key takeaways and tips here? You should understand the different ceremonies or events and the purposes of each. And by understanding those, it really gives you a good grounding to a generic Agile life cycle. There'll be iterations or sprints throughout different approaches. And while Scrum is not the only life cycle within Agile, it is the one that is the most generic. It is the most generic to Agile life cycle and the most common one. This lesson is on extreme programming. Extreme programming, or XP, is one of the most popular Agile methodologies for software development, good or best practices. XP really focuses on technical best practices as opposed to Scrum, which is really a project management framework. XP is a software development discipline that organizes people to produce higher quality software more productively. And it improves software quality and responsiveness to changing customer requirements, all of which are tenets of good Agile software development. XP has 5 core values: simplicity, communication, feedback, courage, and respect. And if you remember the Scrum pillars and principles, these are very similar. The XP lifecycle, which you see on the right, looks very familiar with the standard Agile methodology as well. You start with release planning, you have iterations, acceptance tests, user stories or architectural spikes and standard spikes all play in. And we'll talk about some of these practices in more detail. There are 12 practices that make up extreme programming. The first grouping is for fine scale feedback. The first practice is paired programming. You can see an image of paired programming on the right. This is where two developers work as a pair, and they really sit side by side. One is coding while the other one reviews. This differs from your standard code reviews because these paired programming does reviews synchronously as opposed to waiting. The next practice is the planning game, and this is where you are working to develop both release and iteration plans. The third practice is a concept called test-driven development, and this is where you write your automated tests before you write your code. If you're doing for example, if you are making software that would add two numbers together, you would write the software that says, yes, 2 + 2 = 4 as an automated test, and then write the code to actually add 2 + 2. The fourth one is whole team. And this is where everybody is sitting together. You want everyone to be co-located so they can work through issues together and quicker. And you also have the concept of generalized specialists. This is where people may have special things they can do, but ultimately, if you're a developer, you can work on the front end or the back end or the database. The second set of practices is regards to continuous process. So the first one is continuous integration. This is a concept where every time a developer checks in a piece of code, it gets integrated into the entire code base and tested. And the key thing here is this is all done through automated processes, not manually. Refactoring is improving the design of the current code. And this is where you're constantly trying to keep your software in a good technical state. That way, when changes come, it is easier to fix and implement new requests as opposed to having to go back and fix whole pieces of code in order to implement the new feature. And the third is small releases. Like many Agile practices, frequent small releases are encouraged. The third set of practices is programmer welfare, and the only one here is sustainable pace. Everybody knows that on projects, very often you'll have to work overtime. But in XP, you really shouldn't do this more than for 2 weeks. Long hours are unsustainable over the long term, and ultimately are not even productive, and you don't gain much from it. Over time, you wind up just burning out, and you would be more productive if you just continued to work 40. Originally, XP would say no more than 2 weeks consecutive working over 40 hours, but over time they've not been as hard and fast. And the fourth set of practices are shared understanding. So the first of those is collective code ownership. And this gets at that anyone on the team can work on any piece of code. You don't have individual code ownership where this is my module or that is that person's responsibility to fix. Anybody should be able to work on anything. Now, part of the challenge to that one is when you have lots of different people working on the code, how do you minimize how much change there is or differences because of coding styles? And that is why you have the second of the shared understanding practices, coding standards. And these are sets of rules that teams develop in order to drive everybody towards a more common approach for how to develop. And these could be, do you have curly brackets or straight brackets, and what kind of indentations or naming conventions you might have in your software. And that way, people feel more comfortable and there's less risk if you're working in other pieces of code. The third shared understanding practice is simple design. And constantly you should say, what is the simplest thing that can work? You don't want to over-engineer things for things that might happen. There's an expression, you're not going to need it. And that is where you don't want to over-engineer or future-proof your product too much. You should try and make it simple to implement the requirements as they are today. And then the fourth one is a system metaphor. And this is a tool that you create to have a shared understanding for the team. You want to try and write things in normal English language so everybody on the team, developers, testers, analysts, even your customers, can understand and have a common vernacular. So when they talk about XYZ, everybody understands what it is. So there are roles in extreme programming, and there are 4. The first is the coach, and this person is a mentor for the team, helping them understand the extreme programming rules and practices, and also help them facilitate as needed. The second role is the customer, and this is a business representative who will help determine the priorities and the requirements for the project, and they sit with the team in order to promote a business understanding of the project. So that way, it also is helpful that when people might have questions, you've got this customer person right there to answer, as opposed to having to go find someone that can help you understand. So for example, if you were building a finance product, you might have an accountant on site with the team. And the last 2 roles, developers and testers, are straightforward. The developers develop the software, the testers test it. In extreme programming, testers need to be able to write automated test procedures, because that's a high emphasis and not as much traditional click-through test cases. Now, these roles can be thought of very similar to Scrum roles, where the coach is mostly equivalent to a Scrum Master, and the customer here is equivalent to a product owner. As mentioned before, there's a couple other important aspects to extreme program when you look through the life cycle. So the first is user stories. We'll talk more about user stories in later sessions, but these are requirements and test scenarios that are written for the team to execute. The next important aspect is spikes. And a spike is work that is taken to reduce a risk or unknown. And then it's thrown away. So you might prototype something. You might have to try and understand what's the best library to use in a certain example. This is work that you want to do quick and dirty, not that goes in the product, but to amplify your learning and understand something. And then to take that to a further extent, you might have an architectural spike. And these are much longer periods of time in iteration where you might build a thin stream of the product, or thin slice is a better way of saying it, to prove out a technical approach. This is work that should not go into the product or the code base, but some dedicated work to understand how the architecture for a product should be built. So the key takeaways here, XP focuses much more on technical aspects of product development from development perspective or testing or writing requirements than Scrum does. However, you should absolutely understand and be able to define the practices and roles of extreme programming. This lesson is on lean software development. Lean software development is not a methodology like XP or Scrum, but rather a mindset. It's derived from lean manufacturing, which was made most famous by the Toyota production system. Lean focuses on the value stream. We will discuss more about the value stream in another lesson, but what to take from this slide is there's not a framework called lean software development, but a set of principles and guidance that really apply for all Agile methodologies. Within Lean, there are 7 core concepts. The first is to eliminate waste. In order to maximize the value that you provide to your customer, you need to look to minimize waste that occurs in your project. This just kind of is very straightforward common sense. The more waste you take out, the more valuable features you can deliver to your customer. The second concept is to amplify learning. You want to facilitate communication, and that is from both your teammates and users, and get feedback. This will allow you to improve the product based on valuable feedback from your users, and or improve your processes with feedback from your teammates. Decide later. This concept promotes deferring your decisions as long as responsibly possible. What this means is you don't want to make a decision before you need to. So for example, if there's a discussion over what happens if this test fails, what they would say is, well, don't make the decision necessarily until after you learn if the event is going to happen. The other part is this isn't an excuse to kick the can down the curb and just not make decisions. The responsibly possible part is very important. Deliver fast. You can maximize the return to your customer by getting them the value you develop quicker. So for example, instead of waiting 6 months for every feature to be developed, you can give your customers the first subset of features of your product after a month perhaps, and they can use that feature now for 5 extra months than they would have if you waited the whole time. Empower your team. A fundamental part of Lean and all of Agile is you need to respect the team. You treat them like the high professionals they are, and you give them the knowledge, tools, and environment in order to do their best work. You trust the team, given the right information and environment, will do their best work, as opposed to expecting that you need to oversee them and micromanage them because they're going to try and get out of things. Build integrity in. This concept promotes that you test throughout the life cycle of your project, not just at the end, like your traditional waterfall. This will help you find defects earlier and not put more work, more software or what have you on top of broken systems. The seventh concept is to see the whole, and this promotes a systemic view of what is going on. You want to be aware of the entire system and how decisions in one area can affect other areas, be the organization you're breaking it down into teams or features or what have you. By working on something in one area, there's definitely an effect in another area, and you want to be aware of that. You want to make the right decisions for the entire system versus just a subsystem. Now, there are a few examples of waste that are traditionally brought up as part of Lean, and they're slightly different in software. So the first example of waste is partially done work. And a good example of that is where you might have code that has been developed and completed, but you haven't tested it yet. So that's an example of waste. Extra processes. Very often in projects, you might have a specification that needs to be signed off by people throughout your organization, even if they aren't stakeholders of the project. Well, going around and getting their signatures and dealing with their review, when they don't have the knowledge or skin in the game, just means you're spending more time and it's waste. Extra features. The Pareto's law says that 80% of the functionality of a product comes from 20% of the features or the usage. And so when you're building features that haven't been used, that aren't going to be used, that's an example of waste, where if you could have, you don't build those features and you listen to what your customers say, you can provide more value. Task switching. All of us have been assigned to different projects or multitasking around, and we know that by switching context, there is some implicit waste and time delay where you're getting back up to speed on what's going on. And so task switching is an example of waste. Waiting is a fifth example of waste in software development. When we use the example of going around and trying to wrestle and get all the signatures for requirement specification from before, the time that you're waiting to get approval of those requirements is time that you could be spent in better. Motion. Now, motion is an example of waste, and in the manufacturing world, that's where you may have to take pieces around to different assembly lines or go walk somewhere to get a tool as opposed to having it available. In software, you should view this as digital products, and really that's where you have poor communication between teams, be it a development team and a QA team, or the users and the development team, or whatever. Effort that you have to spend working on communication because it's poor is an example of waste. And then finally, the most straightforward example of waste is defects. And if you've worked in software, there's always bugs in the code or issues in your specification, and that's the example of defects in software. So the takeaways for this section are: you should know the 7 core lean concepts. You should have that list memorized. There may be questions that will ask you some of those. And you should really understand different examples of waste in software development and which groups they might belong to. This lesson is on Kanban. Kanban was derived from the lean manufacturing approach made most famous by Toyota in the Toyota production system. It is a method for visualizing the flow of work in order to balance demand and capacity and spot bottlenecks. The Kanban approach was moved over to software development and has found great success in the last decade. This methodology stresses pulling individual work items to completion with a focus on customer delivery and value, creating sustainable pace, meaning you try to avoid peaks and valleys throughout the workflow, and regular delivery to the customer, giving them a constant pace of value to work from. Kanban looks to optimize the flow of work from the beginning to end, rather than really focusing on details and teams and interactions between them. And another important factor is it looks for just-in-time delivery. It's a little more difficult to understand in software. In manufacturing, you don't want to build up a lot of materials for someone to use. You want to give them the material they need just before they need it. An example for this in software development might be, instead of writing all the requirements up front, you write one requirement at a time. That way, when a developer is ready for that requirement, you have just finished it and could hand it off to them. There are 5 core practices within Kanban. The first is to define and visualize the workflow. Knowledge work projects, by definition, manipulate knowledge, which is intangible and invisible. Therefore, having some way to visualize the workflow is very important for organizing, optimizing, and tracking it. On the right side of this screen, you can see what's called a Kanban board. But what's most important for this point is that you'll see the titles at the top, and this is the visualization of the workflow. Feature preparation, feature selected, user story identified. These are all workflow steps. The second core practice is to limit the work in progress, or WIP. Restricting the amount of work in progress actually improves productivity and increases the visibility of issues and bottlenecks, and facilitates continuous improvement. This makes it easier for the team to identify issues and minimize the waste and cost associated with changes. It also results in a steady pull of work through the development effort, since new work can only be moved forward as existing work is completed. The third core practice is to measure and manage flow. By tracking the flow of work through a system, issues can be identified and changes can be measured for effectiveness. The fourth core practice is to make process policies explicit. It is important to clearly explain how things work so the team can have open discussions about improvement in an objective rather than an emotional or subjective way. The Kanban chart on the right shows some policies at the bottom of the image. The details of those policies are not important, but it does talk about how those steps and processes work. And that's an example of making the process policies explicit. And the fifth practice is to use models to suggest improvement. Through scientific measurement and experimentation, the team should collectively own and improve the processes it uses. Now, we briefly talked about the Kanban board on the previous slide. And here's another example of the Kanban board. This is an example of how artifacts or work items are in the pending, analysis, development, test, and deploy states. And these are the various parts of the workflow. And the next important thing to look at is right here. You see that there is a dotted item that looks like a card was moved from test to deploy. Well, the reason it was moved was there was capacity available to deploy. This is a pull method, which is different from your traditional push method, where all those tests that might be ready to move are all pushed to deploy, regardless of if there's capacity to deploy them or not. And we talked about minimizing WIP as one of the core Kanban process areas. And on the board, you see these numbers, and these are referring to WIP limits. And that is the maximum amount of work that can be going on at one time within those columns. So there can only be 6 items in pending, 3 in analysis, and 5 in development. An important part of Kanban is talking about the bottleneck. Bottlenecks are the part of the system that is the limiting factor. When you find the bottleneck, the important part is to exploit the bottleneck or improve in that area. For example, in the graphic shown below, 10 items per week can be done in analysis, 10 items per week can be done in development, and 5 items per week can be done in test. Therefore, the bottleneck is in test. The maximum throughput is bottlenecked by test. No matter how many items analysis or development can do, until you improve that test area, you won't be able to produce more than 5 items of work per week. So Kanban is much different than some of the other practice areas like Scrum and XP. So how are they different from traditional Agile? Well, the cadence in Kanban is a continuous flow as opposed to Agile where you have fixed iterations. In Kanban, you just continue to go on and on and on and move items through, as opposed to Agile where you deliver to you have fixed iteration lengths. A key metric in Kanban is cycle time, and that's generally defined at taking different points in the life cycle and the time it takes for a work item to go from one to the other. Generally, you look at from the beginning to end, where in a classic requirements, design, develop, test, deploy phase, how long it takes for a requirement to be taken and deployed to the customer is an example of cycle time, while Agile uses velocity as its primary metric. And as I briefly mentioned with the cadence, the release methodology of Kanban is either continuous, where you can push to a customer as needed, or at the team's discretion when the customer may not be willing or able to constantly accept updated software. While at Agile, you only deliver at the end of a sprint. The key takeaways from this section are understanding the 5 core practices of Kanban, understanding what a pull system is, and understanding that one of the most important factors and items in Kanban is to limit your work in progress or WIP. This lesson is on other Agile methodologies. The first methodology we'll discuss in this lesson is feature-driven development. Feature-driven development is one of the older Agile methodologies, and it has 5 main steps. The first step is to develop an overall model. The project starts with a high-level walkthrough of the scope of the system and its context. Next, detailed domain models are created for each modeling area by small groups and presented for peer review. One of the proposed models or a combination of them is selected to become the model for each domain area. Domain area models are progressively merged into an overall model. The output of this stage is a high-level object model and notes to provide context. The next step is to build a features list. The knowledge gained during the initial modeling is used to identify a list of features by functionally decomposing the domain into subject areas. Subject areas each contain business activities, and the steps within each business activity form the basis for a categorized feature list. The output of this stage is a list of features grouped into sets and subject areas. The next step is plan by feature. After the feature list is completed, the next step is to produce the development plan, assigning ownership of features or feature sets to programmers. The output of this step is a development plan and identified class and feature set owners. After you plan by feature, you will design by feature. A design package is produced for each feature. A chief programmer selects a small group of features that are to be developed within the next 2 weeks. Together with the corresponding class owners, the chief programmer works out detailed sequence diagrams for each feature and refines the overall model. Next, the class and method prologues are written and finally an inspection held. The output of this step is a design package. After a successful design inspection per feature activity, you will build a completed client-valued function or feature. The class owners each develop code for their classes. After unit testing and successful code inspection, the completed feature is promoted to the main build. The output of this step is programming, testing, and packaging. The last 2 steps are repeated for each iteration again and again and again. Feature-driven development is built on a core set of software engineering best practices, all aimed at a client-valued feature perspective. Domain object modeling consists of exploring and explaining the domain of the problem to be solved. The resulting domain object model provides an overall framework in which to add features. Any function that is too complex to be implemented within 2 weeks is further decomposed into smaller functions until each subproblem is small enough to be called a feature. This makes it easier to deliver correct functions and to extend or modify the system. Individual and class or code ownership is another best practice within feature-driven development. Individual class ownership means that distinct pieces or grouping of code are assigned to a single owner. The owner is responsible for the consistency, performance, and conceptual integrity of the class. A feature team is a small, dynamically formed team that develops a small activity. By doing so, multiple minds are always applied to each design decision, and also multiple design options are always evaluated before one is chosen. Inspections are carried out to ensure good quality design and code, primarily through detection of defects. Configuration management helps with identifying the source code for all features that have been completed to date and to maintain a history of changes to classes as feature teams enhance them. Regular builds ensure there is always an up-to-date system that can be demonstrated to the client and helps highlighting integration errors of source code for the features early. And finally, visibility of progress and results by frequent, appropriate, and accurate progress reporting at all levels inside and outside the project based on completed work. Managers are helped at steering a project correctly. The next methodology we'll discuss is Dynamic Systems Development Method, or DSDM. The philosophy behind DSDM is that any project must be aligned to clearly defined strategic goals and focus on early delivery of real benefits to the business. There are 4 stages in the DSDM lifecycle. The first is the feasibility stage and business study. The second is exploration, where a functional model and/or prototype will be developed. The third is the engineering or design and build iteration. And finally, the fourth is incremental deployment or implementation. DSDM advocates use of several proven practices, including facilitated workshops, modeling and iterative development, Moscow prioritization, and time boxing. DSDM is founded on 8 principles. The first is to focus on the business need. Every decision taken during a project should be viewed in the light of the overriding project goal, to deliver what the business needs to be delivered, when it needs to be delivered. It is important to remember that a project is a means to an end, not the end itself. Delivering a solution on time is a very desirable outcome for a project, and is quite often the single most important success factor. Late delivery can often undermine the very rationale for a project, especially where market opportunities or regulatory deadlines are involved. The third principle is collaborate. Teams that work in a spirit of active cooperation and commitment will always outperform groups of individuals working only in loose association. Collaboration encourages increased understanding, greater speed, and shared ownership, which enable teams to perform at a level that exceeds the sum of their parts. The fourth principle is to never compromise quality. In DSDM, the level of quality to be delivered should be agreed at the start. All work should be aimed at achieving that level of quality, no more and no less. A solution has to be good enough. If the business agrees that the features in the minimal usable subset meet the agreed acceptance criteria, then the solution should be good enough to use effectively. One of the key differentiators for DSDM within the Agile space is the concept of establishing firm foundations for the project before committing to significant development. DSDM advocates first understanding the scope of the business problem to be solved and the proposed solution, but not in such detail that the project becomes paralyzed by overly detailed analysis of requirements. Once firm foundations for development have been established, DSDM advocates incremental delivery of the solution in order to deliver real business benefits as early as is practical. DSDM uses a combination of iterative development, frequent demonstrations, and comprehensive review to encourage timely feedback. Embracing change as part of this evolutionary process allows the team to converge on an accurate business solution. Poor communication is often cited as the biggest single cause of project failure. DSDM practices are specifically designed to improve communication effectiveness for both teams and individuals. And the 8th principle is to demonstrate control. It is essential to be in control of a project at all times and to be able to demonstrate that this is the case. This can only be achieved by reference to a plan for the work being done, which is clearly aligned with agreed business objectives. It is also vital to ensure transparency of all work being performed by the team. The third methodology for this lesson is CRYSTAL. The CRYSTAL development methodology is a family of human-powered, adaptive, ultralight, stretch-to-fit software development methodologies. It has a range of implementations that is based on the number of people, the size of the project, and the criticality of the project. This ranges from the low end, called Crystal Clear, moving through Crystal Yellow, Orange, Red, Maroon, Diamond, and finally Crystal Sapphire. All of the details underneath Crystal are not super important for this lesson. However, what is important is understanding how you determine what implementation of Crystal is needed. For example, if you have a project with 3 people on it and the impact of your project is to fix a website or a program that freezes for a second, you will probably be implementing Crystal Clear, which is the lightest weight, has the less ceremony or rigor of all the implementations of Crystal. That is in opposition to if you have a project with 80 people working on it and the impact is that a public website goes down. That would be implemented through, you would use Crystal Red's methodology, which has a higher level of ceremony and rigor than the ones to the left of them. So, to perform a very simple summary of all of the methodologies that we've discussed in this lesson and previous ones, extreme programming focuses on technical practices and simplicity. Scrum focuses on prioritization or backlog management and managing your work. Lean focuses on optimizing value and reducing waste. Feature-driven development is about business models and domain modeling. DSDM focuses on business value and feasibility. And Crystal is about tailoring your processes based on size and criticality of the project. So the key takeaways for this lesson are, within feature-driven development, modeling is the key word to remember. For DSDM, feasibility is key. And for Crystal, discipline and rigor is tailored for the criticality, size, and impact of the project. This lesson is on the Agile Mindset. This lesson is slightly different than previous lessons because in this lesson, you're going to learn more about philosophical thought processes and mindsets. For the most part, these are not things that you're going to have to memorize like a list of principles, but rather understand what the Agile Mindset is. There are some tools and techniques and key terms that will be discussed during this lesson that you're going to have to know for the test, and we'll highlight those when we get to them. After the Agile Manifesto was written, Many software leaders work to see what management principles might be required to achieve an Agile mindset and that are critical to managing Agile projects. They published the Declaration of Interdependence in 2005. The Declaration of Interdependence states that we increase return on investment by making continuous flow of value our focus. We deliver reliable results by engaging customers in frequent interactions and shared ownership. We expect uncertainty and manage for it through iterations, anticipation, and adaptation. We unleash creativity and innovation by recognizing that individuals are the ultimate source of value and creating an environment where they can make a difference. We boost performance through group accountability for results and shared responsibility for team effectiveness. And we improve effectiveness and reliability through situationally specific strategies, processes, and practices. The Declaration of Independence gives a good grounding on what the Agile mindset is. Now we continue to discuss what an Agile mindset is. An Agile mindset is customer focused. As mentioned in the Declaration of Interdependence, they focus on the value delivered to the customer or users. An Agile mindset means you're focused on team success and understanding that the team succeeds and fails together, not individuals being responsible for success or causing failure. With an Agile mindset, you are constantly learning about your domain, about practices that might be applicable from the world at large, and your teammates. Having an Agile mindset means you're comfortable with ambiguity. You recognize that you are not going to have all the information available to make decisions, and you will make decisions in the best light possible. With that Agile mindset, you're also failure tolerant. People are going to make mistakes, and things aren't going to work the way you expected them to. And that as long as you are learning, then it's not true failure. And finally, you're never satisfied with the status quo. You are always looking to improve as a team, as a product, as an organization, and as yourself. And having an Agile mindset is the key to being agile versus doing the practices like stand-ups or iterations. If you just follow the practices rotely, you're doing Agile. But without that Agile mindset, you can never be agile. Servant leadership is a concept that has been around for eons. But the phrase servant leadership was first coined by Robert K. Greenleaf in The Servant as a Leader, an essay that he first published in 1970. In that essay, Greenleaf said, "The servant leader is a servant first. It begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. Then conscious choice brings one to aspire to lead. That person is sharply different from one who is leader first, perhaps because of the need to assuage an unusual power drive, or to acquire material possessions. The leader first and the servant first are two extreme types. Between them, there are shadings and blends that are part of the infinite variety of human nature. A servant leader focuses primarily on the growth and well-being of people and the communities to which they belong. While traditional leadership generally involves accumulation and exercise of power by one at the top of the pyramid, servant leadership is different. The servant leader shares power, puts the need of others first, and helps people develop and perform as highly as possible. Servant leadership has a few values or principles that help describe it. This is not necessarily a list that you have to memorize because many people have come up with different values, but rather understanding these are examples of servant leadership. A servant leader values everyone's contribution and regularly seeks out opinions. If you have to just echo back the leader's opinion, you are not in a servant-led organization. Servant leaders cultivate a culture of trust. Gossip is minimized, and pocket vetoes are rejected. Servant leaders help develop other leaders. It means teaching others to lead, providing opportunities for growth, and demonstrating by example. It also means that the servant leader is not always in the position of leading, but rather gives up power and allows others to the opportunity to lead. Servant leaders recognize that well-balanced individuals that have achieved work-life balance are valuable to the organization, so they help people with life issues. These issues might not be an immediate company need, but they are important. The hallmark of a servant leader is encouragement, and a true servant leader says, "Let's go do it," not "you go do it." The image on the right-hand side of the screen best describes this characteristic. A servant leader is the opposite of a dictator. It's about persuading, not commanding. A servant leader thinks about you, not me. So that means they're worrying about how it helps others. If they think about how will this benefit me, that is not the example of a servant leader. Servant leaders think long term. They think about the next opportunity, the next leader, the next generation. And it helps guide trade-offs between what's important today and what's important tomorrow. And the servant leader acts with humility. They don't wear a title to show who's in charge. They don't think they're better than everyone else. They act to care for others. They may, in fact, clean up the trash after a party, order the pizza, do whatever is required to help the team perform at its best. In continuing on with the Agile mindset, it's important to understand the difference between management and leadership. And many of these might sound similar to the Declaration of Interdependence or characteristics of servant leaders. And that's because these are all threads that go together. Management focuses on controlling or directing people or resources, while leadership is about setting a direction or a vision for a team. Management seeks to maintain the status quo, while leadership is about creating change agents for a new opportunity. Management seeks to control risks, while leaders try new things and take risks to try to find better ways of doing things. Management is about administering the activities of an organization, while leadership is about innovating and setting new directions. Management believes that management is about systems and structure as the key factor to success, while leadership focuses on the people aspect of success. Management views things in the short term, while leadership looks for a longer-term horizon. Management is about instructing on how to accomplish activities, while leadership is about encouraging individuals. Management relies on control to accomplish activities, while leadership uses trust from the team for success. Management and leadership are neither good or bad or opposite side. They're more opposite sides of the coin. And what it really gets to is management is about managing work and leadership is about leading people. In traditional project management, this diagram is referred to as the iron triangle, where you have these constraints of scope, cost, and schedule, and if one varies, others need to. You can't fix them all. Traditionally, in project management and projects, we start off with a fixed scope, and cost and schedule will vary. Agile works in a slightly different way. It inverts the triangle, or rotates it rather, and it views that you fix cost and schedule and vary scope. So what this means is, instead of saying these are all of the features or all of the requirements we are going to do, you say this is how many people we have, this is how long we are going to work for, either sprints or iterations, and then that will determine the scope that we can deliver. And as things change, where we are more productive or less productive, then we will vary scope, as opposed to in a traditional world where you need to meet all of the requirements. Therefore, in general, you will push out your schedule and incur more cost. The inverting of the triangle, or the Agile triangle, is an important concept that you need to know for the certification test. Another concept you need to know for the test is information radiators. Information radiator is a generic term for any number of handwritten, drawn, printed, or electronic displays which a team places in a highly visible location, so that all team members, as well as passers-by, can see the latest information at a glance. It is an effective way of communicating project status, issues, or metrics. It's also known as a big visible chart. There are a few expected benefits from information radiators. The first, which is to promote responsibility among team members. By having everything available, team members cannot claim that they didn't know when something was due or that they were responsible for a module. It is the starting point of creating transparency and accountability for the team. A second benefit is it provokes conversation. If you and a teammate are standing at a board discussing things and you see that something is going on, you will naturally start talking about ways to improve and bring the project back towards the project goals. And finally, information radiators show that the team has nothing to hide. It doesn't have anything to hide from visitors. Project schedules are very project status is very visible and anybody can see it, as opposed to having to go find a status report or a baseline project schedule. It also shows the team has nothing to hide from itself and that the team acknowledges and confronts problems, as they will always happen on projects. Some examples of information radiators are a Kanban board, burn down charts, or even electronic build light. We will discuss more about these information radiators in later sessions. So finally, what are the key takeaways and tips for this lesson? The first is to focus on being agile and having an agile mindset versus doing agile and just executing the tasks and practices of different agile methodologies. Agile focuses more on leadership than management. The Agile triangle states that cost and schedule are fixed and you vary scope. This is different than traditional project management where you fix scope and vary cost and schedule. And finally, it is important to understand that Scrum Masters are servant leaders and should be showing the practices and principles and philosophy of such.